August 7, 1942. The skies over Guadalcanal are a chaotic canvas of flak and tracers. Below, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War rages. High above the jungle canopy, a lone Japanese A6M Zero fighter spots its prey, a formation of 8 American SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The Zero is flown by one of Japan's most lethal aces. He moves in from behind, lining up his cannons for an easy kill on the slow-moving bombers, but the bombers have a sting. The rear gunners open fire, filling the air with lead. A single .30 caliber bullet rips through the chaos, pierces the Zero's canopy, and strikes the pilot in the head. American gunners watch as the enemy plane tips nose up, seemingly out of control. Through the shattered canopy, they see the pilot, motionless and slumped in his seat. It is a confirmed kill. The ace is dead. The Americans radioed in the victory and returned to their carrier. But the man they counted as a kill, Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, wasn't dead. Far from it. Blinded in one eye, bleeding profusely, and paralyzed on one side of his body, Sakai was beginning an impossible journey. He would fly his shattered 560 miles back to his base at Rabaul, a flight that took nearly 5 hours. But that isn't the most unbelievable part of the story. Flash forward 41 years. Los Angeles, 1983. An elderly Saburo Sakai extends his hand. The man who takes it is Harold Jones, the American rear gunner who fired the bullet that nearly ended Sakai's life. How did Sakai survive an unsurvivable wound? And why, 4 decades later, would these two men, enemies who met in a moment of lethal violence, be shaking hands? To understand the man who survived that bullet, you must first understand the boy. Saburo Sakai was born in 1916 in Saga Prefecture, Japan. His family name carried immense weight. They were direct descendants of samurai, Japan's legendary warrior class. But the glory of the past was just a memory. Following the Meiji Restoration, his family, like many former warriors, had been forced to trade their swords for plowshares. They lived as poor farmers, a life of honor but also of immense hardship. That hardship became desperate when Sakai was just 11. His father died, and with his death, any hope for a traditional, educated future evaporated. His prospects narrowed to almost nothing. For a boy of 16 with a warrior's bloodline and a farmer's opportunities, there was only one respectable path left. In 1933, he enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He began his career as a bottom-rung turret gunner on the battleship Kirishima, a grueling life of swabbing decks and polishing brass. But Sakai had far higher ambitions. He applied for the prestigious Naval Flight School. He failed. He applied again. He failed again. Finally, on his third grueling attempt, he was accepted in 1937. What followed was arguably the most brutal flight training program on Earth. This wasn't just education. It was a forge, designed to systematically break men and weed out any hint of weakness. Cadets were pitted against each other in vicious wrestling matches that often ended in broken bones. Swimming tests were endurance trials designed to push them to the point of drowning. Any pilot who couldn't meet the impossible standards was sent back to regular duty in total disgrace. Many men broke. But Saburo Sakai, the farmer's son with samurai blood, thrived. He graduated ranked first in his class. In recognition of this supreme achievement, Emperor Hirohito personally presented him with a silver watch. Sakai had transformed. He wasn't just a pilot. He was an elite warrior, certified as the best of the best. Sakai was immediately put to the test, flying his first combat missions over China. As the war exploded across the Pacific, he flew in the invasions of the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and New Guinea. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a natural. He had completely mastered the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the most dominant fighter aircraft in the world at that time. The Zero was an engineering marvel, incredibly lightweight, possessing an almost supernatural agility, and armed with devastating 20mm cannons. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a terror. In the hands of an ace like Sakai, it was a scalpel, and Sakai was an ace, a true samurai of the skies. By the time he arrived at Guadalcanal, official records already credited him with 28 aerial victories. His own autobiography would later claim over 60. The true number is debated, but the fact is not. Saburo Sakai was one of the most seasoned, successful, and lethal pilots in the entire Imperial Navy. He was a warrior at the absolute peak of his abilities. Half a world away, Harold Jones was an American sailor. He wasn't an ace, he wasn't a pilot, and he wasn't a samurai. He was a rear gunner, serving with the air group aboard the carrier USS Enterprise. His office was the cramped rear cockpit of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The Dauntless was the polar opposite of Sakai's Zero. It wasn't a sleek, agile dogfighter. It was a sturdy, heavily armored workhorse, a flying tank built to dive on enemy ships and, most importantly, survive the trip back. Jones's job was purely defensive. He sat facing backward, his eyes scanning the empty sky, his hands resting on twin 30-caliber machine guns. His entire purpose was to be the eyes and the sting for his pilot, protecting their vulnerable tail from men exactly like Saburo Sakai. The life of a rear gunner was one of profound, terrifying isolation. You flew backward, scanning the vast, empty sky, completely exposed. Your pilot was focused forward on the mission. You were the aircraft's only defense from its most vulnerable angle. A single SBD Dauntless was a tempting target for a fighter, but American naval doctrine knew this. Dauntless bombers rarely flew alone. They flew in formations, and when they did, their defensive power multiplied exponentially. If one... Gunners' twin 30 calibers were a threat. The guns of 8 bombers flying together created a flying shotgun, a dense, overlapping wall of lead that no pilot could fly through unscathed. Attacking such a formation from directly behind wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. These two men, Sakai the ace and Jones the gunner, were on a collision course. Their meeting point would be a tiny, jungle-choked island in the Solomons that, until now, most of the world had never heard of, Guadalcanal. This battle, launched on August 7, 1942, was a historic gamble. It was America's first major ground offensive of the entire Pacific War. The objective was a single, muddy airstrip the Japanese were carving out of the jungle. This airfield was a strategic dagger. If it became operational, Japanese bombers based there could strike and sever the vital Allied supply lines to Australia, effectively cutting the Pacific in two. If that airfield was completed, the war in the South Pacific could be lost. The Japanese knew its value. The Americans knew it too. That strip of land had to be taken, and it had to be held, no matter the cost. On the morning of August 7th, as American Marines stormed the beaches, Saburo Sakai's squadron scrambled into the air. But they weren't launching from a nearby carrier. They were based at Rabaul, a staggering 560 miles away. This was a brutal, multi-hour flight just to reach the combat zone. For hours, Sakai and his men sat cramped in their cockpits, staring at nothing but the endless blue of the Pacific, their engines drinking precious fuel. This journey was an ordeal in itself. It was a test of endurance that left pilots fatigued and strained before a single shot was fired. They were already at the edge of their range, with no margin for error, flying straight into the hornet's nest of the American invasion fleet. The battle hadn't even begun, and they were already fighting for survival. When Sakai's squadron finally arrived over Guadalcanal, they were met by a swarm of American F-4F Wildcat fighters. Sakai immediately peeled off, engaging a Wildcat flown by American pilot James "Pug" Sutherland. This wasn't a simple ambush. It was an extended one-on-one duel between two exceptionally skilled pilots. For several minutes, the two aircraft twisted and climbed, each pilot fighting for the fractional advantage that meant life or death. Both men demonstrated incredible skill, but Sakai's experience in the more agile Zero eventually won out. He scored critical hits beneath Sutherland's left wing. The Wildcat, trailing smoke, went down. Sutherland would survive the crash and later become an ace himself. But the engagement proved one thing. Saburo Sakai, even after a grueling 560-mile flight, was as sharp and as lethal as ever. He was at the absolute peak of his game. Fresh from his victory over Sutherland, Sakai scanned the sky. His adrenaline was high, his confidence absolute. That's when he saw them, a neat formation of 8 American aircraft, flying steady, almost daring him to attack. From a distance, their silhouette looked familiar. They looked like Grumman F-4F Wildcats. Sakai had just tangled with one, but these were flying in a wide, bomber-like formation. He made a judgment, a fatal one. He assumed they were Wildcats, fighters whose primary armament faced forward. In his experience, their tail was a complete and total blind spot. For an ace like Sakai, this was a rookie setup. It was a turkey shoot. Confident in his assessment, he jettisoned his external drop tank, lightening his Zero for maximum speed and maneuverability. He banked his aircraft, falling in perfectly behind the formation, leveling out at their 6 o'clock. He was invisible to them. He closed the distance, 800 yards, 600 yards, lining up his cannons for a devastating pass, ready to rip through the entire enemy flight from back to front. He was a shark, gliding unseen toward his prey, and he was completely, terribly wrong. Sakai's finger edged toward his trigger, closing to point-blank range. 400 yards, 300. The enemy aircraft grew larger in his sights, and then he saw it. The silhouettes were wrong. The wings were thick. The canopies were long. And protruding from the back of each aircraft was the one thing he didn't expect, a rear gunner. They weren't Wildcats. They were SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Before Saburo Sakai could even react to his fatal mistake, all 8 rear gunners saw him. 8 men, including Harold Jones, swiveled their twin 30-caliber machine guns and depressed their triggers at the exact same instant. The trap snapped shut. It wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution. 16 machine guns erupted simultaneously, focusing a torrent of lead on the lone Zero. There was no wall of fire. It was a solid, inescapable fist of tracers and armor-piercing rounds. Sakai wasn't flying into a formation. He was flying into a buzzsaw, and it was already tearing his aircraft to pieces. The air exploded. For Harold Jones, the target simply filled his sights, and he held the triggers down, his twin 30s hammering the lone fighter in perfect unison with 15 other guns. It was instantaneous. Jones watched chunks of the Zero's metal skin tear away under the focused barrage. He saw the enemy's canopy disintegrate into a spider web of fractured glass and then simply vanish. Through that shattered opening, just for a fraction of a second, he caught a glimpse of the pilot. He was motionless, slumped forward in the cockpit, seemingly dead on impact. The Zero, now pilotless, abruptly tipped its nose straight up, as if clawing for the sky one last time. It lost all airspeed, stalled, and began to fall away, disappearing back toward the jungle. For Jones and the other gunners, the fight was over. It was a clean, confirmed kill. But Saburo Sakai wasn't dead. Inside the cockpit, it was a world of pure agony. The 30-caliber bullet had pierced the canopy and struck him in the head, just above his right eye. The impact shattered his goggles, sending shards of glass into his face. His vision in that eye was gone, replaced by a curtain of darkness and blood. He was paralyzed on the left side of his body. He was bleeding profusely. For a moment, he considered the warrior's end. He would dive his crippled Zero into an American ship, a final, defiant act. But as he looked down through his one good eye, there were no ships. Only the endless green of the jungle and the blue of the ocean. Then he thought of his duty. He was a section leader. His squadron needed experienced pilots. Japan needed experienced pilots. Dying here accomplished nothing. So he decided to fly home. He pointed his nose toward Rabaul, 560 miles away. For nearly 5 hours, Saburo Sakai flew. Half-blind, half-paralyzed, drifting in and out of consciousness, he battled excruciating pain in the failing systems of his aircraft. When he finally landed, ground crews ran to his plane, expecting to pull a corpse from the cockpit. Instead, they found a ghost. Sakai, caked in blood, waved them away. He climbed out under his own power, insisted on delivering his full after-action report to his commanding officer, and only after his duty was done did he finally collapse. Doctors didn't expect him to survive. The head wound was severe. Infection was almost certain. Even if he lived, they said, he would never fly again. Sakai survived. He lost vision in his right eye permanently, but his will was unbroken. After months of agonizing recovery, he did the impossible. He returned to combat. In 1944, the one-eyed ace was back in a Zero, flying missions over Iwo Jima. But when the war ended, the man who emerged was not the same one who had entered. The relentless warrior, the man who had claimed over 60 victories, underwent a profound transformation. He became a devout Buddhist and made a solemn vow. He would never again take another life, not even that of a mosquito. He returned to civilian life, married, and started a small printing business. His first hires? Fellow veterans, men who, like him, were struggling to find their place in a new, peaceful Japan. The samurai's son had found a new purpose. For decades, Sakai carried the memory of that day. He also carried a question. Who was the man who had almost killed him? In the early 1980s, a historian named Henry Sakida began meticulously researching the August 7th engagement. He cross-referenced American and Japanese records, eventually identifying the SBD squadron and the gunners who had fired on Sakai. One of them was Harold Jones. Sakida arranged a meeting. In 1983, near Los Angeles, Saburo Sakai and Harold Jones met face-to-face for the first time, 41 years after their violent encounter. There was no animosity, only a profound, shared curiosity. These two men were the only survivors of a moment that had defined both their lives. Then, Sakai presented a gift. He handed Jones his old brown leather flying helmet, the very one he had worn on August 7th, 1942, and there, just above the right eye, was a small, neat hole, tangible proof. Jones examined it, speechless. He was holding the evidence of his own marksmanship, a .30 caliber shot from a moving aircraft that had hit another moving aircraft in the head, and he was shaking the hand of the man who had survived it. The impossible flight, the 560-mile journey, the 41-year-old story. It was all real. The bullet hole was the final, irrefutable witness. That handshake began a friendship. Harold Jones and Saburo Sakai corresponded for years, two men bound forever by a single bullet. When asked how he could befriend the man who shot him, Sakai's response was simple. To me, the war was never personal. His life became a testament to the resilience that defined his impossible flight, a message he shared often: never give up. He was also notably outspoken, publicly criticizing Japan's inability to accept responsibility for the war, a stance that made him unpopular with some veterans at home but earned him deep respect abroad. In a final, perfect symbol of this reconciliation, Saburo Sakai attended a formal dinner on September 22, 2000, at Atsugi Naval Air Station as an honored guest of the United States Navy. During the event, he suffered a heart attack. He died that night at age 84, surrounded by American officers who considered him a friend. He had proven that enemies in war don't have to be enemies in peace, and that true warriors can always find common ground in mutual respect.